What's up, YouTube? Zero here, and today I have an absolutely amazing Typhlosion and Arceus EX deck in Pokemon TCG Pocket. In this video, I'll go over the deck build that you can see on the left-hand side of the screen. I'll talk about each of these cards individually, and I'll talk about why this deck is absolutely awesome and you should be checking it out. Before I get into it, as always, I do want to say if you do enjoy this video, feel free to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button for more Pokemon TCG content. Thank you so much in advance for doing so. It does really help out me and my channel. Without further ado, time to talk about this deck. Of course, if you've been playing Pokemon TCG Pocket for a little while, you already know about Arceus EX. It is an absolutely phenomenal card, and it's not going anywhere. Its ability is great, and its attack is just as great. Typhlosion was just released with the PAX Wisdom of Sea and Sky. You're going to be able to find Typhlosion specifically in the Lugia packs. These two Pokemon together are absolutely amazing. They combine really well with each other, Arceus being a normal type or colorless Pokemon, being able to utilize any energy. Typhlosion being a fire type, allowing this deck to run fire type energy, but they synergize really well with each other. Arceus, great with 130 attack with a bench full. Typhlosion is able to burn opponents with its ability Fire Breath, which lights opponents in that active spot on fire, which does deal 20 damage. So that 130 plus 20 is going to be absolutely amazing. But let me talk more in depth about each of these cards individually. Arceus EX first. As I mentioned, Arceus EX is an absolutely phenomenal Pokemon, and to be honest, probably not going anywhere anytime soon. Arceus EX has the ability Fabled Luster, which means it cannot be affected by any special condition. So let's take this deck for example. Typhlosion, which from the bench or active slot has Fire Breath, which you can light the opponent's active Pokemon on fire. Arceus is not going to be affected by that. On top of that, you have other status conditions in the game, specifically poison, which a lot of opponents like to utilize. There are a lot of poison decks in this game, especially with Nihilego and Crobat EX, which like to poison opponents. Arceus EX is not going to be affected by poison. So all of the status conditions, poison, paralyze, confuse, burned, Arceus isn't going to be affected by it, so it can really turn the tide of battle if you're facing a deck that utilizes status conditions. So that's pretty awesome. On top of that, Arceus EX has a move for 3 colorless energy. Again, this deck is running fire, so you equip 3 fire energy onto Arceus EX and its ultimate force, which deals 70 damage. However, it deals 70 plus damage. This attack does 20 more damage for each of your benched Pokemon. So if you have a full bench, Arceus can deal 130 damage. If you have 2 Pokemon on the bench, Arceus is going to deal 110 damage. 1 Pokemon on the bench, Arceus is going to deal 90 damage. And of course, no Pokemon on the bench, Arceus is only going to deal 70 damage. However, 130 damage is really nice, can do a huge chunk to a lot of Pokemon. However, it's not always going to one-hit KO EX Pokemon and powerful Pokemon. There are a lot of powerful Pokemon in this game that are currently the meta that have more than 130 HP. You can see the Pokemon I'm facing right now, Guzzlord EX, has 170 HP. You have you have Darkrai EX that has 140 HP. You have Giratina that has 150 HP. So a lot of Pokemon that have a really hefty HP that are currently a part of the meta. So you just have to be aware that 130 damage can deal a lot of damage to Pokemon, but it may not necessarily KO a lot of Pokemon you're going to be facing in the meta. But that's where Typhlosion is going to come into play, which is really nice. Arceus EX can be found in the Triumphant Light packs if you are looking for Arceus EX. Now, Typhlosion, I mentioned earlier, has the ability Fire Breath. Once during your turn, you may take your opponent's active Pokemon and burn them. Of course, Arceus EX is not affected by this status condition. However, there are a lot of Pokemon in the game that are affected or can be affected by status conditions. So burning a Pokemon is going to add an extra 20 damage at the end of each turn. That means if your opponent doesn't heal it, you can do a lot of damage really quickly. However, burning your opponent is at least going to give you the minus 20 burn damage at the end of your turn. So Arceus deals 130 damage. Add the burn in and you're dealing 150 damage by the end of your turn. That's absolutely awesome because some of the Pokemon I just mentioned, Darkrai EX and Giratina EX, are going to be with that combo one turn KO'd by it. So that's really nice as well, being able to one turn KO some of the meta Pokemon. Guzzlord EX, not going to be one hit KO'd by that combo, the burn and the Arceus attack. However, you can see in the bottom right hand corner of my deck, I do have red up my sleeve just in case, but I'll talk about red a little bit more later in the video. Typhlosion also has a move, Magma Punch. For 2 fire energy, deals 60 damage. So not amazing, but when you combine that burn, 80 damage for 2 energy is a little bit more acceptable. Not too bad. Burning enemies is going to be really nice though. And what's nice is Typhlosion can burn enemies from the bench. So that's really cool as well. Typhlosion in this deck also gives you a counter to Oricorio. Of course, Oricorio is a Pokemon that you can either prepare for or just forfeit whenever you see that your opponent has Oricorio. That's up to you. However, I do like to plan for Oricorio when I'm playing in ranked because you can see a lot of Oricorios, especially as you get higher and higher in ranked. And for those of you who don't know, Oricorio does not take direct damage from EX Pokemon. So just be aware that if you do create a deck of only EX Pokemon, you're not going to be able to directly damage Oricorio. So it's always nice to have a non-EX Pokemon in your deck that can deal a fair amount of damage to Oricorio. And Typhlosion, with its burn plus Magma Punch, can one-hit KO Oricorio that does have 70 HP. And as I mentioned, Typhlosion is going to be in the Wisdom of Sea and Sky Lugia packs. Now, of course, have to talk briefly about Cyndaquil, which is the basic Pokemon of Typhlosion. Cyndaquil for 1 fire energy, deals Flare for 20 damage. That's going to be found in those same packs as Typhlosion. I do skip the Stage 1 Kilava in this deck. I have 2 rare candies in place of him. And of course, for those of you who don't know, rare candy, as long as Cyndaquil has been on the playing field for at least 1 turn, if you have a rare candy and a Typhlosion in your hand, you can evolve right into Typhlosion, skipping the Stage 1, in this case, Kilava. So it's important in a lot of decks that you want to directly evolve into a Stage 2. Rare Candy is an insanely important card, a really phenomenal card to have. Rare Candy is going to be found in the Celestial Guardians packs. The last Pokemon in this deck is going to be Magby. Magby is phenomenal for colorless decks, for fire decks. Magby has Toasty Toss. For no energy cost, baby Pokemon do not have an energy cost. For no energy cost, you take a fire energy from your energy zone and attach it to one of your benched basic Pokemon. So just be aware it is basic Pokemon that you can attach a fire energy to, no evolutions, so you can't attach one to a Typhlosion. However, if you have a Cyndaquil or an Arceus EX on your bench and you have Magby in that active slot, you can utilize Toasty Toss and attach a fire energy onto one of those two Pokemon. So you can really expedite the fire energy buildup with Magby in that active slot, which is why I absolutely love Magby in this deck. A great card to have in a lot of fire decks in which you want to build up fire energy quickly. It's a great card to have for this deck because you can get Arceus 3 energy really quickly. And Magby is going to be found in the Wisdom of Sea and Sky Ho-Oh packs. Next, couple of basic cards that I have in this deck. Pokeball, you put a random basic Pokemon from your deck into your hand. And of course, Professor's Research, you draw 2 cards. Next, let's talk about now the supporter cards that are in this deck because they can do a lot for you. First, I'm going to talk about Sabrina because it is the only supporter card outside of Professor's Research that I currently have 2 of in this deck. So just be aware that you can add or subtract a second of any one of these supporter cards if you do want them. However, I have each of them in this deck for a specific reason. But I do love Sabrina, as always. If you've watched my previous videos, you already know about Sabrina. I love Sabrina. It's a phenomenal card, can really throw off your opponent's strategy. Sabrina, you switch out your opponent's active Pokemon to the bench. Being able to do this can throw off your opponent's strategy. It can get a Pokemon out of that active slot that you don't want to deal with because it has a tool on it or it has a decent amount of energy and you just don't want to deal with it. You can push potentially a Pokemon from your opponent's bench that has a high retreat cost into that active slot, or perhaps a weaker Pokemon into that active slot. Sabrina has a lot of uses, but it's really great to utilize in battle in a lot of different ways. So I absolutely love Sabrina, and Sabrina can be found in the Genetic Apex Charizard packs. Next, I have one of each of these cards. I have one Cyrus, one Mars, one Leaf, and one Red. I mentioned Red earlier, but let's circle back to Red and talk about why it's great for this deck. Guzzlord, I'm going to utilize Guzzlord as an example, had 170 HP. Arceus deals with a full bench 130 damage. Typhlosion with Fire Breath can add an extra 20. So 20 plus 130 is going to be 150. Guzzlord, as well as other Pokemon that have 160 or 170 HP, even Pokemon that may utilize a giant cape, such as the Darkrai EX that I mentioned earlier, or a Giratina. Darkrai EX with a giant cape goes up to 160 HP. Giratina goes up to 170 HP. There are a lot of ways Pokemon have or can get to 160 and 170 HP. So 130 damage plus our 20 damage from Typhlosion is really fantastic. 150 damage is absolutely great. However, there are going to be Pokemon that are just out of that 150 range. EX Pokemon that are out of that 150 range. So Red is going to come into play to allow us to KO those Pokemon. For those of you who don't know, Red during this turn, attacks used by your Pokemon do plus 20 damage to your opponent's active Pokemon EX. That means if there's an EX Pokemon in that active slot and you know that Typhlosion plus Arceus is not going to one-hit KO, or maybe you don't have your Typhlosion on the bench ready to give that extra 20 damage and you need 150 damage, you can potentially utilize Red to one-hit KO whatever Pokemon EX that you are attacking. So Red is going to be a phenomenal card for this deck, so you can get over the hump in certain circumstances. And Red is going to be found in the Shining Revelry packs. Next, I have one Leaf in this deck. So during this turn, the retreat cost of your active Pokemon is 2 less. So Typhlosion has a retreat cost of 2. Arceus EX has a retreat cost of 2. I mentioned earlier that Arceus EX really likes it when you have Pokemon on your bench. The more Pokemon on your bench, the more damage you're going to do with Arceus EX for its attack. Well, you may have a Pokemon in that active slot for whatever reason that you either don't want to attack with, or you want to move out of that active slot. Perhaps you have an Arceus EX that you started the battle with in that active slot, and you don't want it there. You can utilize Leaf for a no retreat cost. You take away 2 of the retreat cost, so it's going to be 0 for Arceus. Move it to the bench because you don't want it there. Perhaps you have 2 energy on your Typhlosion and you don't want to utilize those 2 energy to retreat it. You can utilize Leaf again to conserve those 2 energy. There are a lot of uses for Leaf in this deck to get either Typhlosion or Arceus out of that active slot without having to worry about wasting energy, which is going to be phenomenal to get another Pokemon in that active slot and not waste energy. You may have an Arceus EX in the active slot with 1 energy, and you want Magby in that active slot to expedite some of that energy buildup. Well, you can utilize Leaf, move Arceus to the bench without having to worry about wasting energy, get Magby in that active slot, and start building up more energy on your Arceus. A lot of uses for Leaf in this deck, but I do like having 1 Leaf. It can play a vital role. And Leaf is going to be found in the Mythical Island packs. Next, Cyrus. Cyrus is always going to be awesome. You switch in one of your opponent's benched Pokemon that has damage on it to the active spot. When you have a deck that utilizes status conditions in particular that allow your opponent to retreat, such as poison or burn, your opponent is going to retreat. They're going to get that status condition off of them. They're not going to want to have to deal with it, especially burn, because it deals 20 damage. So that's pretty important to utilize Cyrus against those opponents who are going to be retreating their Pokemon to get that burn off, or to protect their Pokemon that have a decent amount of damage. Cyrus, you switch in one of your opponent's benched Pokemon that has damage on it to the active slot. So even though burn is going to give your opponent, or kind of persuade your opponent to retreat a Pokemon with damage on it, Cyrus isn't going to allow them to keep them on the bench for very long. So I do have 1 Cyrus in this deck. Cyrus is found in the Space Time Smackdown Palkia packs. Last but not least, Mars. Mars can be a gift and a curse, and you have to utilize a decent strategy with Mars. So for those of you who don't know, Mars, what you do is your opponent shuffles their hand into their deck and draws a card for each of their remaining points needed to win. Mars does require a little bit of strategy. I wouldn't just utilize Mars to use Mars. If your opponent has 3 cards in their hand and they have 3 points left to win, I wouldn't just utilize Mars to allow them to just get a new hand, because honestly, you never know what's in their hand. However, if you're coming down to the end of the match, your opponent has 1 point left to win, and they have a fair amount of cards in their hand, you may want to utilize a Mars to get rid of all of those cards. You could get rid of a lot of decent cards. You could get rid of a red that deals 20 extra damage to your Arceus. You could get rid of a Sabrina that may force one of your strong Pokemon out of that active slot and one of your weak Pokemon to that active slot. You could get rid of a Cyrus. A lot of uses for Mars. Requires a little bit of strategy, but phenomenal for this deck. And Mars is going to be found in these Space Time Smackdown Palkia packs. That's the deck. I absolutely love this deck, and I recommend y'all checking it out. Let me know in the comment section if you've checked it out, what you think of this deck. Thank you for sticking around. I hope y'all enjoyed this video. Make sure you hit that thumbs up button and subscribe. And until next time, peace.